In this video, we're going to learn how to pass data from your Django applications to your JavaScript on the front end. Now there's different ways of doing this, and some are very insecure. What we're going to do in this video is learn some best practices for doing this, and we're going to learn about this JSON script template filter that Django provides. Now this video is going to reference a good blog post on this topic by Adam Johnson, and that's titled How to Safely Pass Data to JavaScript in a Django Template. I'll link to this blog post below the video. Let's now get started. What we're going to do is we have a starter project in Django, and we're going to build a very simple model that we're going to then pass to our JavaScript on the front end, and we're going to see how we can reference these values that are coming from the back end within the JavaScript code. So let's go to the models.py file, and I'm going to build a very simple model here, and it's going to be a band model. So let's write that now, and that will inherit from Django's models.model class. And that model is going to have two fields. Firstly, the name of the band, which will be a char field. And secondly, we're going to have a number of members field, which is a positive small integer field. Presumably most bands will have 10 or less members with some exceptions. So we'll make that a positive small integer field. Finally, let's quickly add a dunder string method here that will return the band's name. Once we've done that, we can run the python manage.py make migrations command. That will create the migration file that tells the database how to add this band table. Once we've done that, we can then run the migrate command that will then actually create the SQL-like database in this project, and it will create that table. Now, to get some test data for this simple video, what I'm going to do is create a super user and add some bands in the admin interface. So to create a super user, what we can do is we can run the python manage.py create super user command. We'll give the super user a name of admin, and you can give it any password you'd like. Once we've done that, we can go to the admin.py file, and what we're going to do here is register this new band model with the admin UI. So at the top of this file, from core.models, we'll import that new model we've just created. And below in the section it says register your models here, we can call the admin.site.register function, and we can pass the band model to that. That's the very simple, easy way to register a new model with Django's admin UI. Now we can run the Django development server with the python manage.py run server command. If you go to the page that we've already set up by default here, it just says hello, nothing interesting going on here at the moment. What we can do is go to the /admin, and on this page we can log in with our new admin user. So now we're on the admin page. I'm going to now add 5 or 6 bands to this, and you can do that by clicking the button at the top right here, and then you can add the name of the band as well as the number of members. So now I've added 6 bands to the database. What we're going to do is we're going to add these bands to our context so that we can access them in the template. So let's go to the views.py file, and at the top of this we're going to import the band model, and then the dictionary that defines the context, we can add a key called bands, and that's going to map to the band.objects.all. And this function here will return every single row within the band table in the database. So now that our bands are in the context, what I'm going to do is go to the templates, and we'll go to the index.html template. This currently just says hello. I'm going to remove that, and we're going to paste a UL tag. And within the UL tag, we have a template for loop, and we're rendering out a list tag with the band's name for each band in the database. So let's save these files, and we can go back to our page now. When we refresh that page, we now have a list with our 6 bands in the database. Now the purpose of this video is to see how can we take the data that we have on the back end and access that data within JavaScript code that's running in our Django templates. And there's all sorts of reasons you might want to do this. You might want to get access to a URL that's defined in your backend, and you might want to send an AJAX request, so therefore you would need access to that URL within JavaScript. There are some examples of how you can get access to context data in JavaScript code on this blog post. If we scroll down a little bit, here's the method that I've used in the past. Sometimes it's not recommended, and also it's very dangerous in certain circumstances. That's when you define a script tag here, and then you have a variable in JavaScript that's set to an expression like this, where you're referencing something in the context and you're using the Django template syntax to convert that to a value. This can be a security issue, and it also doesn't look particularly nice either. And as the author of this post points out below, a malicious value can be used that can then actually execute JavaScript within your own page. So what we're going to do now is explore some different approaches to how we can actually get access to these values within script tags. Now, one way that's suggested in the blog post here is to use data attributes. Now in HTML, any element can accept these data attributes. For example, here we have a script tag that has a data username. And to define a data element, you simply use the data keyword with a dash, and then you can give it any name you want after that, in this case, username. So let's go back to our template now. What I'm going to do is to each list element, we're going to attach some data attributes for the band's name and the number of members that are in that band. So let's define a data attribute, and this one's going to be called data band name. And we can set that equal to the band's name. So in this case, it will be band.name. So we're attaching the band's name as a data attribute to the list element. We're going to do the same for the number of members in the band as well. So let's add a second data attribute below here, and that's going to be data band num members. And again, we're setting that equal to the band.number of members field that's on the model. So let's save that file and go back to our page here. If we refresh this page and we go to the developer tools, when we inspect the elements defining this list, you can see that the HTML tag now has these data attributes with the correct values for each band. So we've taken the data from our backend that's in our context, and we're now attaching it to the HTML elements for each band. The question is, how do we access that within JavaScript? What we're going to do now is we're going to add some JavaScript code that gets access to this data. When we click a band, it's going to show details about the band just below the list. So let's see how we can do that. Let's close the developer tools, and we're going to go back to our index.html template here. And what we're going to do below is we're going to define a script tag, and within that script tag, we're going to get access to all the list elements. So in order to do that, let's create a variable called elements within our JavaScript code, and it's going to be equal to document.querySelectorAll, and we're getting all elements that are list tags in our template. So this line here will simply return all elements in the DOM that match the selector that's passed as an argument. Now what we want to do is when we click a list element, we want to then load data below the list for the particular band that we've clicked. So what we're going to do to each LI that we've found here on line 15, we're going to add a click listener that will handle adding the details to the DOM for the band that we've clicked. So what we're going to do is we're going to loop through each of these elements, and we can do that with the elements.forEach function, and that's a function that array-like objects in JavaScript have. It takes a callback function, so we'll use a JavaScript arrow function here, and for each element we're going to define a click listener. So for each element we use the add event listener function, and we're listening for the click event. And what we'll do is when we get that event, we'll call another function. This is the callback function that happens when we click an element, and it's going to be responsible for adding the details to the DOM below the list. So what I'm going to do is define a function here called addBandDetails, and we pass the element that's been clicked to that function that we're going to define now. So below this code within our script tag, I'm going to paste the function addBandDetails. That takes the element that's been clicked, and then what we're going to do within the body of this function is add the details of that band to the DOM below the list that we have. So let's create a container for the band details. Just below the unordered list, we'll create an empty div with the ID of band details, and we're going to get a reference to that div within our script tag. So let's define another variable here, and we'll call this one container, and that's going to be equal to the document.getElementById function, and that takes the ID of the element that we're trying to get. In this case, it's band details. So now we have the container that references this div. We're going to place the details of the band we've clicked into that div below in this function here. Now actually what I'm going to do is, as well as the element that's been clicked, we're going to pass the container that we want to place the data into. We're going to pass that as another argument to our function here. So let's now paste that in as an argument. And now we want to get access to the element that's been clicked. We need the data for that element. Now if we look above at the list elements, each one of them has these data attributes attached to the element. Now in JavaScript, you can get access to data attributes very easily. So let's go to our function here. We have a band element that's been clicked. That's an HTML element. To get access to the data attributes in JavaScript, we can reference the element's dataset property. So let's get that, and we'll store it in a variable called data. And we're going to console log this data to the browser's console so that we can see how it looks. So let's refresh this page. And when we load up the developer tools, if we go to the console, when we click a particular band, it's going to fire that event that calls the function that we're interested in. So when we click that, we get back a DOM string map. That's essentially a JavaScript object, very similar to a dictionary in Python, and it contains the data attributes from that particular HTML element. For example, the band name, and you can see that it's turned the dashes into camel case in this case. So we had band dash name, now we've got camel case, and it contains the name of the band, and we have the same for the number of members. So we can now access these values very easily within our JavaScript function. We have the data, we get that by accessing the element.dataset property, and we can then reference, for example, the name of the band by using the data.bandName property on the data. And from that data, we can then reference individual pieces of the data. For example, the data.bandName will give us the name of that band. And remember, use the camel case. And if you're unsure about that, just console log the element.dataset while you're developing, and you'll get access to the key names for each piece of data. So what we're going to do now is I'm going to create a couple of new HTML elements using JavaScript, and we're going to insert them into the DOM. So within this function, below the data, I'm going to create a name element here, and that's going to be a new HTML element. And we can create an element in HTML using JavaScript by calling functions such as document.createElement, and we're going to render the name of the band as a header. So we're going to use the h1 tag for that. So we're programmatically creating an h1 element using JavaScript, and this h1 element is going to contain the text for the band's name. So let's create another variable below here called name text, and that's going to be equal to document.createTextNode. So when you're creating text in JavaScript, you simply call this createTextNode function, and you can pass the text that you want to apply as a parameter to this function. Now the text that we're going to use comes from the data that we've attached to the list element, and it's the band name in this case. So we say data.bandName. So now that we've created the h1 element and the text, we're now going to append the text to that h1 element. So what we need to do is we call this function here on the name element, it's the appendChild function, and to that we can pass the name text that we've got above. So we're appending the text node to the h1 element. So that's the code for the name of the band. We can do something similar for the number of members, because remember that's also in the data that we've attached using the data properties above. So what I've done here is pasted the code for this. It's exactly the same as the code above for the band name. We create an element, in this case an h3 element, and we then create a text node that contains the data for the number of members in the particular list element that we've clicked. Finally, we append the text node to the h3 tag using the appendChild function. So these are all functions that are defined in JavaScript for DOM operations, such as adding elements, adding text nodes, and appending elements to other nodes. So that's us created elements for the data that we have. We now need to actually add them to the DOM. Now we defined above here this container element. It references this empty div here. That's where we want to place the elements that we've just created. So let's scroll down to the bottom here, and we're going to take that container and we're going to call the append method. This is similar to appendChild, but instead of appending a single node, what we're going to do now is append two child nodes to this container. And that's going to be one for the name element and another for the members element. Let's save that file and go back to our page and see what's happening here. I'm going to close the DevTools and refresh. When we click a particular band, you can see that below the list, we're now actually appending the details for that band to the DOM. And this is done by using these data attributes that are attached to each element in the list. When we click the band, we use the dataset property on that element in JavaScript to extract the data that we've passed from the backend to the front end, and we can then do anything we want. In this case, we've got a fairly trivial example of just displaying the data, but you might want to do something more useful, like using that data to call an endpoint or performing some sort of manipulation on that data. And if I click another band here, you can see that that band's actually added below the original band, and this will just keep happening for each band. So what we're going to do here is actually add a function that's going to clear any existing bands when we make a new click event. In other words, we want to take our container div element and we want to clear it out when another click happens. Now let's go to the Mozilla documentation. We're going to learn about another function that's defined in the document object model, and that is the node.removeChild function. So for the node that this function is called on, it will remove the first child from that node and it will return it. We're going to use this function to clear out the children from our div container element. So let's go back to our code here, back to the script tag. We're going to define a new function here called removeContainerChildren. That takes the container as an argument, and we can then call the container.removeChild function. However, this will only remove the first child for that container. If we go back to our code above, you can see that we've appended 2 child elements to that container. So the question is, how can we remove all children from a particular element? If we go back to the Mozilla documentation, I'm going to scroll down and there's a section on how to do this just below here. To remove all children from an element, you can see that a while loop has been defined, and while the element in question has a first child property, you can then call the removeChild function, and that will remove all children until the first child property evaluates to false. So let's go back to the function that we're about to write here called removeContainerChildren. I'm going to paste some code in here, and it's basically a carbon copy of this. We're passing the container to the function, and while the container has that first child attribute, it's going to call the removeChild function. So that's the function that will take care of clearing out that div. What we now need to do is call this function when a click event occurs. So let's go back to this elements.forEach loop. This code attaches the click listener to each li element in the DOM, and when that click happens, we call the addBandDetails function here. What we also want to do is call this new function that we've defined, and that will clear out existing bands from that div. So above the addBandDetails function, we're going to call the removeContainerChildren function, and we pass the div to that function as an argument. Let's save this and go back to our page now. When we click one band, you can see that it appears below the list, but when we click another band, it no longer appears below that other band that was originally clicked. We now get that replacing the existing band, and that's what we want. So that covers data attributes. What about the JSON script template filter that I mentioned earlier? Why would you want to use this instead of a data attribute? Now, data attributes are perfectly fine when you want to pass simple values from your backend code to JavaScript code. Sometimes you have complex values or a lot of values, and you don't want to pass multiple data attributes that represent each of these values. This is mentioned on Adam's blog post. If we scroll down here, you can see that this section here, there's no limit. A script or any element can have as many data attributes as you like. However, at some point, adding so many attributes might not be ideal. So you can use JSON script in this case. If we go to the documentation for this filter, you can see that it outputs a Python object as JSON, wrapped in a script tag and ready for use with JavaScript. So this is very useful for passing complex values to JavaScript from your backend, and it can also be used with things like Alpine. If you're passing JSON data to an Alpine component, you can use JSON script to convert values to JSON and then load those into the component using the JSON.parse function. I'm going to show how to do that in a future video. In this case, I just want to show you how to use JSON script. You can see that if you have a value here, you can use the JSON script filter and you can attach an ID. That ID will be applied to the script tag, and you can then reference that to get the content. So let's show an example of this. If we go back to our Django view here, what I want to do is take this query set of band objects and convert this to a simple list of dictionaries. Now you can use Django REST framework or Django's built-in JSON encoders to do this. However, we have a very simple model here that contains a string and an integer, and these are primitive values, so they're very easy to convert to dictionaries and include in JSON. If you have more complex models, you'd probably want something more robust. So in our view, what we want to do is turn this query set into a list of dictionaries, with each dictionary representing the data for one band. And we can do this quite easily using the band.objects.values function, and .values will return a query set of dictionaries rather than model objects. So the difference there is when you normally call the .all function or any other function, you get back a query set of populated Django models. And these are Python objects that contain fields and functions. The .values function is different. The resulting query set contains a dictionary for each row in the database. So that can actually be better for performance in some cases, because you don't need to populate an entire Python object. You just get back dictionaries, which are very efficient. But this isn't about performance. This is actually what we can do to get back a list of dictionaries. We can simply call the list constructor on that band.objects.values, and that will turn the query set of dictionaries into a list of dictionaries. If we now go back to our index.html template, we can dump that data to a script tag using the JSON script template filter. So remember, we have in our context this value of bands, It's a list of dictionaries now, so we can use that in our template. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to put this below the div. We can use Django's template syntax to reference the bands, and then we use the JSON script template filter, and we can pass an ID to that. So this will generate a script tag, and we can give it the ID. In this case, I'll call it band-JSON. So let's save that template and go back to our page here. If we refresh this page and inspect the developer tools, you can see that below the div we have now a script tag. It has the ID that we've attached called band.json, and we attach that ID as an argument here using this syntax. And you can see that the script type is of application/JSON. So this is now JSON data that's been converted from the list of dictionaries on our backend to an application JSON script, and it's been done using the Django JSON script template filter, and this data is now accessible within our template. So let's now see how we can use the JSON script to actually get access to this data within the script that we wrote down here, and how we can use that to get the same functionality that we wrote using data attributes earlier. Now what I'm going to do, if we scroll up to the top here, we're going to get rid of these data attributes here that we've defined earlier on, and this time we're going to define a data-index attribute. And this attribute is going to be equal to the for loop.counter0. So if you're not aware of this, in Django template for loops, there are some special attributes attached to for loop, and one of them is counter0, which will tell you which iteration number you're in the for loop. And let me fix that, that should be 2 curly braces there. If we save that and go back to the page, let's expand the UL, and you can see the data index is set to 0, 1, 2, 3, 4 and 5. So we now have an index for each li tag. Let's now get a reference to the script that's been dumped by the JSON script template filter. We're going to get that by its ID, which is band-JSON. So let's go back to our JavaScript code, and at the top we'll get a reference to that JSON here. Let's call this variable JSON data, and it's going to be document.getElementById, and we'll pass the ID of band-JSON. So that gives us back the HTML element. We can call .text content on that to get back the text within that element, which will evaluate to the actual data that you see here. So that gives us back JSON data. We can then call JavaScript's JSON.parse function, and that will convert that JSON data to an array of JavaScript objects. So this is a very good way to pass complex data from the backend to JavaScript. You create the list of dictionaries or the dictionaries, you dump the data to a JSON script using this template filter, and then you can load that in by getting access to the script and calling the JSON.parse function. So we now have this JSON data ready to go. We can console.log it to see what that looks like in the developer tools. And if we refresh this page and go to the console, you can see we get an array of 6 JavaScript objects, and each object represents one of the bands. Now what we're going to do now is amend the function that we defined here to add the band details. Let's console log the data that we get back from the data attributes here when we click a particular function, or when we click a particular band rather. So let's click Led Zeppelin, and you can see that object has a key of index, which we can retrieve by using the band element.dataset and then accessing the .index property. And we can rename that variable index in this case. And below that we can get the particular band that's been clicked by using the index that we've got there, and we can index into the list of JavaScript objects, the JSON data. So let's copy that, and let's define a variable called data here, and that's going to be equal to the JSON data, and we can use the indexing notation here and index in at the particular index that we've retrieved from the data attribute. So this is just like indexing into a Python list. We've got a JavaScript array of objects, and we're getting the particular object that's been clicked by using the index. If we console log that data, we can see what that looks like. So when I click a particular object, we get back a JavaScript object, and it's got the ID, the name, and the number of members. And you can see that the style of this has preserved the underscores from the backend. So we have a name, but we also have number underscore of underscore members. These are coming directly from the Python dictionaries on the backend. When we serialize these to JSON using the JSON script template filter, it will keep the names as they were on the backend. So what we're going to do is amend the names that we've got here in our data. The band name is simply now name, and we can change band num members to number of members. Let's save that file and go back to the front end here. If we close that off, when we click a band, we're now still getting the band details appearing below the list. So all our code is now working with JSON script instead, and we're using the index of the objects within that JSON data to actually load the correct information. Now if we load the developer tools again, when we click an element here, you might notice that we've got the primary key, the ID of the element. So this is a database database ID, we don't need this in the front end, and you might want to hide that from users. What we can actually do here is go to the backend, go to the views.py, and we can change the signature of this values function that we're calling, and we can specify as arguments the fields that we want to have in the dictionary that's returned for each row. So in this case, we want the name of the band, and we also want the number of members. We don't want the ID, the primary key, so we don't specify that as an argument. If we save this and go back to the page, for each object we should now not have the ID in that list. And we can see that when we click on a particular band, we now have the name and the number of members, but we don't have an ID. So the key takeaway from this video is that when you want to pass data from your backend application to JavaScript, you can do it in two main ways. You can use data attributes, which you can see we've used here, for example, the data index. That will attach data directly to an HTML element, and then you can retrieve that data within the JavaScript using the element.dataset property. Alternatively, if you have more complex data or lots of data, you can use Django's JSON script template filter to dump that data to a script tag that you can then reference with the JSON.parse function to convert the JSON to JavaScript objects. And once you have those objects within your JavaScript, you can do anything you want with them. You can reference URLs, you can do interactive things, anything you want. And these values that we're serializing, they don't need to come from the database. So I could, for example, add a simple Python list to the context. So let's create a key here called, let's say, member options, and we can specify a list of 2, 3, 4, and 5. I can then go to the index.html template, and we could dump that list to JSON data using the name of the context variable, in this case that's member options, and then we use the JSON script template filter again, and we can give that an ID of, let's say, member options here. If we save that and go back to our page and refresh, let's inspect the DOM here, and you can see that below the original script of the band JSON, we now have another script called member options. Again, it's of type application JSON, and this is a simple list of numbers. We can parse that into our JavaScript and then reference any values within the list and do what we want with those. So when you're using Django, it's very easy to take these data structures from your backend and pass them to the JavaScript on the front end. We'll see additional use of the JSON script template filter in a future video about 𝗖𝗵𝗽𝗀 if you're interested in that. For now, that's all for this video. Thank you for watching. If you've enjoyed, please like and subscribe to the channel, and we'll see you in the next video.